You said you wanted to see this, so I'm going to show you. This is a different group of kids. Last year, David and Goliath. I'm not going to talk about it afterwards so we can move forward, but I had a couple requests to show this, so. I wanted to make this like a Marvel movie, so at the end of the credits, they have a bonus scene. So those were all their contributions. Anyway, I feel like your day has been very enhanced by kids telling Bible stories. All right, we're going to get through the rest of this stuff pretty quickly here. Everybody on the team ought to have a role. What happens sometimes, the reason committees sometimes don't work so well is that people don't have roles. They don't execute the work. They decide the work that others are doing. Or they shoot down the work that others are doing, and what tends to happen is that you've got a peanut gallery that just shoot holes in other people's ideas. So everybody ought to have a role, and I want to share with you what some of those roles will be. Now, the ideal team size is somewhere between 4 and 7 people, according to brainstorming studies. You get more than 7, and it's too hard to narrow ideas down. You get less than 4, it's hard to generate ideas. So the sweet spot is there. I have been on teams larger than 4, and I have been on teams larger than 7 and smaller than 4, and it can work. But this would be ideally between that. Now I'm going to share with you more than 7 roles because one person may have more than one role. First role is that of the pastor. Or the preacher. It's really difficult to create this type of worship without having the pastor present. It is her job or his job to create or to redeem the metaphor that you're going to come up with. So the team can have all sorts of great ideas. If the pastor is not participating, it often doesn't work. One team I was a part of, the pastor met with us. felt like he needed to go to another meeting that was happening on the same night as our design team. We designed worship around a metaphor that we thought was great. He came in on Sunday. We're telling him on Sunday morning, here's what this is and what we're thinking. We had sent it all to him ahead of time, but he had a busy week. Nothing he talked about in the worship experience really had anything to do with the metaphor that we came up with. And we tried another time, didn't work. I can't remember, we had like a metaphor of clowns, and he was afraid of clowns as a kid or something. He was like opposed to our metaphor the second time. And so it only took 2 times for us to realize that he had to be present, because friends, notes don't talk. He can't just send his notes and say, hey, design something off my notes. We tried that. Did you know there's more than one commentary of the Bible? I mean, we're all reading the same words, right? But we respond to them differently. We need somebody there to say, no, I don't mean that. I mean this. That's close, or this. So pastor has to be present. I apologize if you came today without your pastor and you're dying to do some of these things. Now, the good news is Sean has been back there recording this day, and this will be available on the conference website somewhere, I think. And so if you want to let your pastor tune into this later on his own or her own, I would definitely encourage you. And I'm assuming this would be on the Equipping Vital Congregations website, equippingvitalcongregations.com, I think. But they'll be able to participate later. We could probably even make the PDF handbook available for download, I would imagine, right? We'll figure that out. Okay, so first role is pastor. Second role then is that of music director. Now notice here, I did not say band director. I did not say organist. It can, whatever type of music you do. I hope that you've heard this today. Sometimes people walk out of this day and they say, oh, how do you do this in traditional worship? Like, I thought I talked about that all day long. I hope that you are hearing that it doesn't matter what style of worship you do, this creative element can exist in either format, no matter what style of worship you're doing. So what I would suggest here is that you don't have the entire band in your worship design team or the entire music team on your team, because what will happen is it will become a music process meeting. And you'll start talking about what key do we want to do this in, and do we want to modulate from A flat to E flat, and let's do this song in 4/4 versus the 3/4 version, whatever. That's not really the purpose of this meeting. This meeting is to set the creative direction. Third role is, I would recommend that this is 3 different people. Your pastor is a role, your music person is a role. This is a role that is extremely valuable and could be shared by a number of people, but it is the role of worship producer. And I would invite you later, not necessarily now, but I'm going to point it out to you now. In your handbook on page 11 is the role of the worship producer. This is the most important role that you don't have if you don't have a role like this yet on your team. And basically, they're the keeper of the theme and the metaphor. The best worship producer I ever worked with was an unpaid person, not a staff person. So when the team dreams together, somebody's got to record what ideas that we came up with. Yesterday, I would say in our team meeting, Kathy was like our worship producer in a way, because she took extensive notes of all the things that we talked about. She's helping to assign roles, who's going to carry out this task and that task, and I would assume will help get resources in place and things like that. You could have 3 or 4 worship producers, and you might assign them per series. So for this series, our worship producer is so-and-so, and they're going to handle all the details on that one. If you were doing a design retreat, you were trying to get 2 or 3 series designed in that amount of time, then you might have 2 or 3 different worship producers that would handle details. This next role would be a shared role. It is the role of the writer. Once you up your game creatively, you really need to have words prepared ahead of time to redeem these metaphors. So you don't want to walk out and say, this morning our scripture comes from, and you pull up the bottled water that's on the graphic, and you say, and our metaphor is about bottles and how we're vessels for Christ, and God fills us up, and everything you've heard me say in those calls to worship that I've shared with you, or those spoken word pieces, I or somebody wrote those at some point, and I learned them, and It's not word for word. I don't say it the same way every time, but it's prepared ahead of time. We might call those talking points. So somebody ought to prepare those things. You can do that for prayers, so lightly script prayers. It doesn't mean that your entire prayer has to be written out, but what is some of the language that we might use? Part of the resources that we're developing for Charge Conference will be to help give those who are leading those Charge Conferences words to integrate the metaphor. So it's that exegetical process that I talked about before. Also, this is how you reclaim testimony time. So we'll say my good friend Jean here has just gone on a mission trip, and I don't know Jean at all, so Jean may be the most articulate speaker that you've ever met. She's probably more articulate than I am, which is not saying much because I'm not that articulate. But let's say that we want Jean to tell the story of the mission trip she just came back from. Now, Jean may not be a public speaker. If she were to get up, she might not know how to tell her story, or might go on longer than her story that we can bear, like I have done several times today. So what I like to do is sort of like the late night television show method, and that is that before you ever see somebody sit down with Jimmy Fallon or Jimmy Kimmel or any of those late night show hosts, a producer does an interview with them ahead of time before they are on the show. They will ask them questions, they'll record their responses, they will tell them what questions that Jimmy's going to ask. I can say that and cover two people. What cover Jimmy's going to ask, and then everybody knows ahead of time basically what's going to happen. So I might call Jean early in the week and say, okay, Jean, you just came back from the trip to Harrisburg where you were working with the soup kitchen. Tell me how you felt before you went. All right, well, so tell me, so she would go on, and she could go on for 15 minutes, and I would take notes. If you remember at annual conference this year, we had the video with the piano tuner, and I actually spent about an hour on the phone with him before Sean actually went and interviewed him, and so we had already prepared the conversation and knew ahead of time. He knew what he knew what Sean was going to ask him. Sean knew basically what he was going to answer, and then we had everything sort of figured out ahead of time so that it wouldn't go on for 20 minutes or whatever. It was going to be a short thing. So I might record her answers. Then I would take those answers, script them, turn them into little sound bites, and say, now, Jean, you don't have to learn this word for word, but if you could familiarize yourself with it, I'm going to ask you this question, and your response really ought to be this, because this is what we talked about earlier. Now, if you want to change anything, change it, but let me know. Here's the second question, here's the response, and so on. And then you conduct it as an interview. It's not that Jean gets up and reads off a card. I would say, friends, I want to tell you about some amazing things that have been happening in the life of my friend Jean. She just came back from a mission trip. Can we all give God a little hand clap for Jean being willing to share with us this morning? Jean, tell us about this trip that you just took to Harrisburg to work with the soup kitchen. Jean would begin to talk. Now, here's the number one rule. This is not about Jean. This has nothing to do with Jean specifically. But the interviewer always holds the microphone. They don't let go of the microphone, because the moment the person you're interviewing takes the microphone, it can get way out of hand and go on and on and on. So, Jean, tell me about that trip that you took. Now, if Jean starts to say, that first night I tried some food that I'd never had before, and boy, it made my stomach feel funny, and I could say, yeah, but specifically, Jean, you were telling me about this little girl that you met in the line at the soup kitchen. Can you say a little bit more about that? And so then I knew that she was going to say that because we had an earlier conversation, and that helps us take what could become 15 minutes and make it 3 minutes. And while I'm talking to Jean, we might have pictures on the screen. Thank you, Jean, for being an unwilling participant today. You're willing. You're great. Bonus points. But we could have some pictures of the trip on the screen. It just really creates a wonderful interview. So that's a way to reclaim the testimony time. Next role is that of tech director. This is oftentimes the grumpiest person in the room. No offense to tech directors, but they live by a premise I call under promise, over deliver. So you'll say to a tech director, hey, we're doing that Wright Brothers thing this weekend. Is there any way we could have a model of like the Wright flyer up on the chancel so we can kind of show people what that looked like? And they'll look at you and be like, that's impossible. What are you thinking? We can't, there's no way to light that, and we can't do that. I don't know what you show up on Sunday morning and it is there, and it looks like it was installed the day the building was built, museum quality. Like, Whoa, how'd you do that? That was no big deal. Under promise, over deliver. I think part of it is that tech folks, oftentimes have this thankless job. We don't know all the hours and things that go into things like that. But what I have found is that there are kind of two types of creativity. There's sort of left brain creativity and there's right brain creativity. And what I have found is that with tech directors, they're sort of more left brain creative. They love things with 3 and 4 letters. HDMI, XLR, VGA, flux capacitor. Like those are all things that, but when you're sitting there talking about Play-Doh and stuff, they do this through the meeting. And you're like, okay, how are we going to pull this off? And they're like, we'll hook up the XLR cable to the flux capacitor. We'll go 1.21 gigawatts back to the future. And that's where they get really excited. So I have found that sometimes it's best to sort of involve them at the end of the process. Nothing is worse in the creative environment than this face. And that actually kind of sucks energy out of the room when you're trying to design and there's somebody that's not engaged. So do watch that when you're forming your team. If somebody does not ever talk and they don't engage, that extra body in the room does consume some energy. I don't know how to describe it in any other way. It just sort of sucks the creative energy away. So involve your tech folks. And when you come up with the plan, they say they can't do it, they'll still do it, and you'll be so blown away by it when they do it. Creative people, I do not want to narrow this for you because there's all sorts of different types of creative people, but graphic artists, interior decorators, I haven't talked a lot about it today, but one of the things I love to do is kind of build the metaphor into the space if you can. Some of you may have remembered a few years ago for annual conference, we did this door theme for the leadership report. And so we had a line of doors, which unfortunately we didn't ever redeem by speaking about it. We've corrected that in the years since. But how can you make that metaphor come to life? You saw the big Play-Doh bucket that we showed earlier. I know one church I did some work with, they don't really even use their screens all that much, but they call it the ambient arts team, and they like to build the metaphor. And the day that I was there, they had a working lighthouse that was probably about as tall as that flag there. And there was a light on it that would spin, and their metaphor for that series was Beacon of Hope. And so they made the room feel like you were kind of at sea. Another time, one of my favorite, super easy but really effective examples they did was their worship was sort of in the round, half round space, or just like that. They put home plate up on the chancel, and they ran out 2 white lines, and they had bases kind of where first, second, third base would be. And their series was called You're Welcome at Home. And they had at one point a prayer where people came forward for communion and walked the bases and came home. When they came home, they were anointed with oil, reminding them that they are safe at home. And that was done in conjunction with the beginning of baseball season. So that week, people were tuning in to see, baseball start, and the hope would be that every time they were tuned into baseball, they were reminded that we are a community where you are safe to be a part of who we are. So I thought that was kind of neat. One church that I worked with, they had a former political cartoonist who would draw pictures for the pastor. So he'd say, hey, can I have a picture of Noah building the ark and people laughing at him? So she'd draw this picture, and then they'd scan it in the computer, and they'd use it in the sermon. The only real downside to this was that all of the disciples looked like Bill Clinton, which I thought was always strange. But, here's a role that you have never probably considered, but it is a really, really valuable role for worship, and that is the role of a new believer. Can you imagine the questions a new believer might ask when you're designing worship? Now, when I say new believer, I don't mean that you go down to downtown Williamsport and have somebody you drop to their knees, pray the sinner's prayer, and come back and join your team. I don't mean that fresh necessarily. But who do you know that didn't grow up in the church? Maybe they've just been in church for the last 3 or 4 years of their life, but they don't know all of our language, all of our rituals, all of our insider stuff. I love having people like this on the team. And we are really bad in the church about speaking Christianese language, even though we don't recognize it sometimes. I told you about those secret worshiper consultations I do. I like to sit in the back and watch, as I mentioned. I was in Las Vegas about 2 years ago, secret worshiping, and the pastor, they were meeting in multi-purpose type space, a gymnasium. And this was their non-traditional worship. They had a really beautiful traditional sanctuary. But he said, I get visitors all the time to the non-traditional worship. I guess people come to Vegas, they do whatever they're going to do in Vegas, they want to leave it in Vegas, confess on their way home, and then leave. So he said, I was watching people in worship in this non-traditional service. He said, you all know about the power of the Holy Eucharist, right? I was sitting in the back, and this lady in front of me, African-American lady, turned to her daughter, who appeared to me to be about 10 years old, and she said, nope. And her daughter goes, you don't know about the Holy Uterus? And I was like, whoa, that's a really different metaphor than I think he was talking about. And so I told the pastor afterwards, I said, do you want to hear what I heard today in worship? He's like, what? And I told him, he's like, oh my goodness. He said, I guess I should have explained what I meant by Eucharist. I was like, uh-huh. Probably so. So we have to be careful about our language. One time I was designing worship with the team, and the pastor said the same thing. I'm going to talk about the power of the Eucharist. This new person in church was on our team, and she turned to me and she said, are we going to play cards in worship? And I said, oh, you're thinking of the card game Euchre. And she's like, yeah, didn't you say something about Holy Euchre? Like, there's a church version of that game? And I was like, no. And I said, ask the pastor. She said, I'm not saying that to the pastor. I said, the pastor needs to hear that. Say it. She said, Pastor, you said something about Euchre, and I only know that to be like this card. I love playing it, but like, what do you mean Holy Euchre? He's like, no, Eucharist. And so he begins to explain it, and he's like, I guess I better say that in the sermon. Uh-huh. You probably ought to say that in the sermon. So new believers don't know the rules, so they will ask questions that we don't even think to ask anymore. Last role is really an extension role, but somebody that loves to do research. There are people that love to find facts. This is a great way, if you have shut-ins in your church who can't make it there, but maybe watch a stream online or a broadcast. There's a church I worked with that had a researcher, and she said, I so love being a researcher and watching online because I see the pastor include things in the sermon that I came up with or the stuff that I helped find, and it makes me feel so much a part of the congregation. So if you've got people that are savvy enough to get online, you might say, we're doing a relationship series in February, and I'd love for you to get me the statistics on the divorce rate, and does counseling make a difference, and if you're a person of faith, does that make a difference? Or can you find me 5 movie clips that are about relationships? They will know ahead of time. You may use all of it, you may use none of it, but that's a great way to involve those who might not be able to physically make it there, or who just love research. So those are all roles that you might consider. Last 2 thoughts on team, and then we're going to finish up with our conversation about technology, which, by the way, I pretty much always do that one in about half an hour, so you didn't really miss anything. Remain static. What I mean by that is your team should not be an open door that is revolving and new people are coming every week. You really want to protect the sanctity of the safe space that you have built with those people. One new person joining the team completely changes the dynamics of the team. It's not team 1.1, it's now team 2.0. Because everybody has a relationship or a lack of relationship with that new person. Think about the conversation you have around the dinner table with your family. You know, you're probably willing to talk about anything. Politics, religion, whatever. But if you invite your neighbor from down the street that you kind of know, but you wave to them, and you think you might know their name, you might get their mail every once in a while. If they come to dinner, your conversation is probably going to be a lot different. You're not going to be as out there about stuff. You're not going to share as many opinions. Well, when you talk about creativity, that's heightened because you don't want to say something that makes you sound stupid, or you don't want to alienate that person. Sometimes the creative process can be really irreverent. And you might not be irreverent around somebody you don't know. And sometimes if you're not irreverent, you don't ever get those good ideas. Everybody needs those McDonald's moments, right? So you may not say, I'm not going to say McDonald's in front of that person. They'll think I'm crazy. So just know that that team needs to remain static. Now, the caveat to this rule is if it's not working, you got to get new people on the team. So you do have to sort of figure out. And a couple other thoughts on this. Number one is when you are recruiting new team members, I would recommend that you set a 90-day trial for their participation in the team. The reason I say this is that if it's just open-ended and they're not working, it is exceedingly harder to have a conversation with a person to say, you know, this doesn't feel like you're a good fit, and they didn't know it was coming. You know, it's painful to experience it that way, but if you say, hey, at 90 days, whether it's working or it's not working, we're going to have a conversation, and you can tell us if you're feeling like it's good, or we may tell you that this may not be a good fit. Also, rather than just saying this isn't a good fit, goodbye, there are two other ways that they can serve. They can be on the development team, or they can be on the deployment team if you want to split it out into different responsibilities. So I noticed that when we're brainstorming, you don't say a lot, and that's totally cool. But we're looking for people who feel really comfortable in that in-the-moment brainstorming. And so I think it might be a better fit for you to help us take those ideas and make them a reality. So if you wouldn't mind being a part of our development team, we'd like to see you help lead that process. And then it's not like you're saying you're just out or you have no use to us. But what do you think about serving there? So that's one thing to consider. Second thing is I would recommend that you ask people to serve on this team at a minimum for a year, because you don't want to have somebody come for 2 or 3 months, form synergy, and then they're gone and you have to start all over again. The other thing is don't have all of your team members start at exactly the same time and make a year commitment, and at the end of that year they all end at the same time because your entire team is gone, then you have no continuity. So you want to stagger it a little bit. If you're asking, now a year is random. I mean, you could have an open-ended thing, but if you could say, if you would commit to this team for at least a year, like you do with board chairs and other positions in the church, you just want to keep that continuity going. The last thing then is that these teams take time to develop. I don't want you to think for a moment that after today, you're going to go home and apply what you've experienced and like you're going to have synergy next week. It takes 6 months to a year to fully achieve synergy as a team. Now that does not mean that you can't immediately start doing better things in worship. I want you to hear that you have to work through some hard stuff sometimes. Conflict is sometimes a part of the process. One other thing I want you to hear me say that I haven't really said yet today, and I just want to be clear on this. Don't try to implement everything you are hearing me talk about today all at the same time. Like, give yourself some time. I'm going to say more about this in a minute, but in case I forget later, I just want you to hear, figure out what the one thing is that I've talked about today that you think is within your grasp, and try that for a couple months. And then after you feel like, I've got that one down, let's maybe do that other thing Jason talked about. Give that, if you were to try and implement everything you experienced today, you will fail miserably because there's too much change. You can't do that much all at once. So please, phase this in over time, and just, my challenge to you is to figure out one thing that you heard today, and within the next 2 or 3 months to try that. And then after you settle into that, try the next thing, and then the next thing, and the next thing, and so on. Don't bite it all off at one time. All right, let me shift over to our fourth and final session here. You all have been wonderful today and being flexible with me with the schedule. Yes?
Say another word or additional word on get all these creative and gifted areas in their zones. Say a role about the importance or the leadership acumen of helping people keep the main thing, purpose the main thing, and how much energy you can anticipate that taking.
Yes. So one of the things that I will often talk about with that whole time to develop thing is that conflict is a natural outcome of people that are passionate trying to do something together, and not everybody always has the same understanding. So this is where I think that revisiting that purpose statement comes in, where we're constantly, that purpose statement is something that you don't send out and have carved in stone and then bring back, because in 6 months hopefully you're going to be a different church, which means that things are going to look a little different, which means that the leaders have to constantly cast vision. Like when I was serving at Ginghamsburg, the guy that co-wrote Digital Storytellers with me, he was the head media minister, and I was kind of a step down from him. And he took about 6 months off of casting vision to write that book. Actually, it was the book that he wrote before that. And the ministry really suffered from it, because once you stop casting vision, people start to kind of flounder a little bit. They kind of lose their way a little bit. So I just want you to hear again, if you're a note taker, write down and underline again. You have to do the work of the team, and you have to do the work on the team. And the moment you stop doing the work on the team starts to drift. And it won't be long before people don't come to push buttons on the computer. People don't come just to show up for a meeting, but they want to help transform lives. And if they don't understand the why behind why you're doing what you're doing, then they'll lose. I mean, there are better clubs that you can go hang out at, right? There are places that have better food. There are better environments than some of our buildings. Like there's so many other things you can fill your time with. And if they're not doing it for the purpose behind it, then it won't be long before they lose interest in what they're doing. So I just want you to hear that the why matters as much, really more than the how we do it. Does that address, do you think? Okay. Because I see a lot of teams kind of forget. You build a team and you think we're done. We got all the warm bodies, right? But it's really about continually casting that vision. All right, let's talk about some next steps and how you might, if you like what you've heard today, and you think, okay, Jason, I love it. Let's say we're a year in. How are we going to keep this going? I want to share some next steps with you. Now, if you're somebody who you've been sitting here all day long, you got a little bit of heartburn because you like what we're talking about, and you think, I really could see the value in this, but boy, oh boy, I think I know about 4 people who are going to call my district superintendent the moment I start trying to implement this stuff and ask for a new pastor. Or worse, they're going to hunt me down. One of the best pieces of advice I can give you in the beginning is to, rather than debate this, demonstrate the power of it. Show them, don't just tell them, but show them what this might look like. Now, we have a couple times a year that if you don't plan worship ahead at all, you might plan ahead at Christmas. You might plan ahead at Easter, maybe Mother's Day or something. I would recommend that when you are going to show them what this looks like, do it in a time that they're already open to you doing something a little bit different, a little bit over the top. Another great piece of advice that I have for you is that if you have young people involved at your church, you might use a youth Sunday to usher in some of these new ideas. Parents and grandparents are a lot less likely to be critical and say how much they hate what you did in worship if the young people are involved in making it happen. And I'm not suggesting you be manipulative, but if you were to say, hey, this morning, you all are used to normally just seeing the song lyrics on the screen, but this morning we have a graphic that kind of portrays this idea of being shaped. And I just want to mention that one of our high school students, Joe Smith, gave his time to do it. Can we just give God a hand clap for Joe's gifts and his willingness to, how many people you disarm by giving them a sense of like where that came from? And isn't it exciting to see our young people excited about their faith? If that call to worship that I've been sharing with you is done by somebody in your congregation that's a beloved member of your congregation who people love to see up front, they may accept that in a way that if the pastor gets up and does it and they don't see that as the pastor's role or whatever. I mean, choose wisely who you have sharing these things. I also would recommend, some of you, I don't know if anyone in this room has ever done any church planting or anything like that, but oftentimes when we do church planting, we do preview services. You don't get a second chance to make the first impression, both in this style of worship, but also when you're trying to start a new church. And so they will actually do sort of practice services ahead of time. You might even consider grabbing a small handful of people if you're trying to move in this new direction, if this is new for you, and say, hey, we're going to do this service a couple times before we do it for our congregation so that they can see what it looks like. I have a friend who's a Presbyterian pastor in Schenectady, New York, who asked his congregation if they would just humor him to let him do once a quarter what he was calling a digital age worship service, which is just a creative worship service. So he would set up a screen, he would show video clips and things like that and do this thing, and he'd wait, 3 months for the fervor to die down, and then he would do it again. And it wasn't long before, after 6 months of doing this, 3 times, they said, Pastor, if you want to, you can do this like once a month. We still want all of our tradition all the rest of the time, and so he started doing it once a month. And then it wasn't long before they were like, okay, if you do it every other week, we're okay. As long as we can still have our tradition on every other week. And then after a while, it was like, we're kind of tired of seeing that ugly screen up there that you set up that's, an old 1970s screen or whatever. Can we please install a screen? And this was the kicker. They installed it over the pipe organ, which I couldn't believe. Jesus didn't come back either. I mean, it was I thought for sure, And so it wasn't long before they were like, on the weeks that they weren't doing it anymore, people felt disappointed that they weren't getting those creative moments. And so it was like not long before, now he told me it took 2 years. But over 2 years, they phased in switching to this new form of worship. And it wasn't that he forced it down their throat and said, that's it, cold turkey, this is what we're doing. It was like, can I just have a Sunday a quarter? How about every other Sunday? Or once a month? How about every other Sunday? Oh, let's just do that. We love this, right? So demonstrate, don't debate. Now, I do think it's really important that you have a foundation for why you do this. I hope that you've heard that all throughout this day, that for me, this is not about just creativity, but about transformation. Let me give you a few verses to have in your back pocket for when people say, is this even biblical? I shared the one with you earlier, but I would quote it again. Mark 4:33 gives you a great model for how Jesus didn't say anything without using a parable, and he explained it when it was over. So Mark 4:33. Now, I don't have all the references in my head, so I'm just going to use the stories for you. Jesus talks about the 99 and the 1. And there are 99 that are in the fold, and he talks about how you have to leave the 99 behind. I got to leave 99 behind to go after the ones that are lost. Sometimes we are so focused on the 99, we dwindle down to 1 because we're afraid to make the 99 unhappy to go after the ones that are lost. So helping your congregation understand this is a 99 and 1 principle. We are working to create worship that will reach those who are not yet with us. Remember, we're not the customer, so to speak. We have such a consumeristic attitude sometimes about worship. If it's not delivered in the way I want it, and the temperature I want it, and the songs I like. One of the members of a congregation that I knew that switched to a new form of worship, there was this guy with a real missional mindset, and he goes, we haven't sung a song here in 3 years that I like, but I'm excited to see new people here. He was really behind this move. Another scripture I think is very helpful is Jesus talked about new wine and old wineskins. The wineskin in worship that we are using sometimes was, perfect in 1955, and we haven't really updated it all that much. And so the wine is seeping through the skin, it's breaking through, it's about to burst, maybe has bursted, and people will never get to drink that wine. They will never get to taste that new wine because the wineskin that is wrapped around it is so old. And so I want you to hear, this is about remaining true to our core values, not changing our core values, but changing our cultural expression of those core values. How can we deliver this message in a way that speaks to today. And friends, I don't mean leaving our tradition behind. If that's the methodology that speaks to your congregation and to those you're trying to reach, how do you even find a new wineskin to wrap that tradition in so that people can taste it? Last one I'll share with you is Nehemiah 8, where Ezra is reading the law to the people, and they have never heard it in their language before. And the Levites are out translating the law into the language of the people, and they are weeping because they've never experienced the law in their own language. They've never heard it before in a way that speaks to them in the way that it was in that moment. And I think we're in that same place today where sometimes the way that we deliver the good news, we force people to learn our language in order to experience that good news rather than bringing that language to them in a way that is native to the language they speak. Now, you might, prior to the first time you do, if this worship would be something new for you, maybe before you do that, you do a series on moving in a new direction or whatever, and using some of these verses to talk about how it's time to deliver the message in a new way, and we're gonna experiment, and so we're gonna have a Sunday. We'll set aside a date in the future where we're gonna do our very first more creative worship experience, and we're just gonna do it once this quarter, and then next year we're gonna do it again, and so on. So demonstrate, don't debate. I kind of said this a moment ago, but don't try and do everything you've experienced today. Figure out what is one thing that you've heard today that you can do well. Master that gift, that skill, and then move on to the next thing and the next thing. But take steps. Next thing I would recommend to you is that every congregation is a little different. And there are probably some gifts and skills in your congregation that I couldn't even identify to tell you what that thing is, but find your niche. What thing are you really great at? Maybe you have really gifted interior decorators in your church. Like, whose home pastors have you visited and you think, wow, he or she is a really great decorator. I wonder how they might be able to help us make what we experience in worship even more meaningful up front. There was a gal that came to this seminar with her pastor 2 times, and the pastor wrote me an email after the second time she came, and she said, this gal, and she's I think in her early 70s, she said, I found my calling. It took me my whole life, but I found my calling. She loves to make the metaphor present up front. So she told me she put golf clubs all over the front, in front of the big chancel, the table, the altar table. And they were talking about a mulligan. In golf you get a mulligan, which means it's do-over. So they use golf clubs and stuff. And then another time she covered the altar in gingham cloth and set it like a table, and we're all welcome at the table. It was like a picnic table type metaphor. Another time she wrapped the entire thing in wrapping paper and put some other gifts, and it was all about God's gift to us. So her thing is that every time they do a series now, they do something with the altar that brings that metaphor to life. So that's their niche. There's another church that I did some work with that they had a landscaper in their congregation, and he I don't think I've described this yet. We did a series series that used the same scripture that I used for a domino effect. As the Father loves me, so I love you. And we used the metaphor of the ripple effect. This was the graphic for that. When people walked into worship, everybody got a smooth stone. And we put one of those like kid pools, like the little $10 blue pool, but we covered it with a black tablecloth and put some plants and rocks and stuff around it. So there was a moment in worship where we invited people to come up and drop their rocks in the pond, as a symbol of the ripples that they would make. No, that's the way I've done it other places. The story I'm going to tell you here is that this church, when they did it, they had 2 different worship spaces. One did a contemporary, like a gymnasium, and then they had a really beautiful traditional sanctuary. And this church really struggled because they felt like they had 2 separate congregations. It wasn't one church, it was 2 congregations. So they were talking to me about how can we help these people feel like they're one church. And so the other time I did this, we did it with the pool. But in this situation, they had a landscaper who built temporarily this little pond in between the two sanctuaries. They did this same service in both. Their worship ran simultaneous. They did the same metaphor in both services. In the traditional space, they don't have screens, but somebody made a banner that had concentric rings on it, like that ripple. So they used the banner as the way to represent this. They had me come in, and I actually started the worship in one service and then went to the other one and did the call to worship. But I told a story about throwing a rock in a pond one time when I was out on a camping trip, and the ripples that formed out in the middle eventually met me where I was standing, and my one action transformed that. And have you ever considered who had an effect on you that brought you to this place? So anyway, everybody got those smooth stones on their way out of worship and were invited to cast the stones into the pond. But we did it at the same time, so the entire congregation, the entire church, both services, were together dropping their rocks in a pond. It was a really neat symbol of those two congregations making a difference together. And they did that several times. We did another thing with a chalkboard where people had a piece of chalk and they wrote names of people that needed to pray. It was a back to school series. But that metaphor kind of brought their church together. By the way, if you're going to hand out rocks in worship, I have 2 tips. Number 1, there should probably be an age limit. And number 2, don't preach on tithing. All right. I appreciate the 4 of you that are still laughing at my bad jokes. Thank you. Next thing then is to be diligent. Don't ever get to the point where you think, okay, we've arrived. We've got it figured out. We're all done. We've gotten to the end of. We checked off every box that we heard Jason say today. I hope that if you come to this seminar in a couple years, you hear different things. That my goal is to continue learning and exploring. And I'll be honest with you, I am still working hard to figure out what kind of worship speaks to the millennials. It's a different. I'm not suggesting that everything you've experienced today translates to that generation, but I do know that when you ask them to collaborate with you, because I've done this, you will reach the people that you're trying to reach if they're part of your development process. So don't ever feel like you've arrived, but continue to try new things. Now, as you up the game in worship, I have 4 things I want you to think about doing every week, and some of you may not do any of these things. Well, I hope you do at least one of them. But I have a recommendation on something that should happen every Sunday. And that is that every Sunday you should talk through what you're doing prior to worship starting. You have to talk it through. I keep saying this all day. I can't tell you how much, but it's my catchphrase today, I guess. Can't tell you how often I will go to worship, and it's as if the people that are participating in the service had no idea until they looked down at the bulletin that, oh, I'm supposed to go up there right now. We almost allow worship to happen by accident than being very purposeful about it. So I think everybody that has a role in worship is going to create some angst, but needs to show up a little bit early, maybe 10 or 15 minutes so that we can talk through the worship order. Everybody ought to know. I was at a church that I was coaching in Chesapeake, Virginia, back in April, and the pastor got done making the introduction for the offering, and there were no ushers. Looking off like, where are the ushers? Where are the ushers? Somebody had to run and go get the ushers because they weren't paying attention and had no idea when the offering was supposed to happen in the service because they didn't talk through it. So it's as simple as we're starting with this video clip, and then after that, this is where you talk about those transitions. I told you about the importance of transitions. When the clip is done, here's the cue for you to go up and stand at the podium, because when this happens, there's only 5 seconds left before that starts. And then what is the last verse of that song you're going to play? You might play the last stanza. Okay, so when that's done, as soon as you hear that part, that's when we're going to do the storytelling, the biblical storytelling. Just talk through each element. That way everybody can say, wait a minute, I'm confused. I thought we were doing this part first, or work that stuff out ahead of time. And friends, if you do 2 worship services, don't let the first worship service be the tech rehearsal for the second worship service. That's not fair to the people that come to the first one. So talk it through. Second thing then is to walk it through. Now, I don't mean that you should show up an hour early and do a full dress rehearsal for worship, but what I do mean is that you might just run a couple of the pieces. So I might say, I'm going to play the last 10 seconds of that clip so that you know how long does it take to get from that seat over there up to here, just so you can feel that. You develop a little muscle memory around it. So we're going to just work the transitions and check the mics. You know, how often does it happen in worship that you go to, you know, the mic's not on or whatever. We forget to even check those things sometimes. Oh, there's no batteries in it. Whoops. Okay, then the third thing, super important. You probably do this, I hope, but if you don't, I certainly encourage it. Pray it through. Circle up your team. I think your ushers should be a part of this circle too. Circle up your media people, your music folks, whether that be the organist or the band or the bell choir or whatever, but everybody's involved in worship. Let's just circle up and pray that the Holy Spirit would bless this time that we have this morning. God, speak through us. Let us get out of the way and let us be a reflection of you. And then finally, you're going to do it. And the thing is not everything that we plan works out exactly the way we plan. But at least if you know what was supposed to happen and you've walked through some of it, when it doesn't go the way you thought it might, you know how to get back on track, as opposed to having no clue how it was supposed to go, what the plan was. And that's where real train wrecks happen in worship, is if you have no clue what it was supposed to be, and then it doesn't go the way you thought it was going to, and then you don't even know how to get back to where you're supposed to be. Next step that I have for you is that we really need to get connected. And what I mean by get connected is become a student of the culture. You know, look for creativity in the world around you. You know, next time you're somewhere near Hershey, go to the Hershey Park and walk around and see how a theme park does hospitality and creativity. I love to go to Disney World. I just walk out of there inspired with 4 or 5 new ideas every time I go. So try to rejuvenate your creativity as often as you can. And also you might consider changing up your television viewing habits. You know, I will sometimes tune into Lifetime, the women's network, just to see what kind of imagery appeals to women. I can't figure out what y'all are crying about, but I mean, some of the acting on some of those shows, those Hallmark shows are pretty bad sometimes. But or like I don't really like sports all that much, but I will sometimes watch ESPN just so I can see what kind of fonts and graphics and what the pacing of that stuff looks like. Look for ways to be a student of the culture. Yes. Yep, that's okay.
Depend on your team.
I think that if you're not a TV and movie watcher, that's totally okay. But that's where team really does help us, because the people on your team, if you surround yourself, like I'm not a sports fan at all. I barely, I'll watch the Super Bowl, but I mostly watch it for the commercials. I love the commercials. But I want to make sure that I've got people around me that know baseball and football, because I know that a lot of the people that I am ministering to are really into those things. And so I have to surround myself with people that make up for that weakness in my area of expertise. So yeah, I would say you don't have to become an expert. Also, I would say if you're not super tech savvy, I certainly wouldn't recommend that you learn how to do social media and Twitter and all that. Like, there are other people that can do that. You do the part that you're really great at and that's natural for you, and surround yourself with people that don't have the same skill sets and make up for the ones that you don't have. That's a good question. All right, let me go through. This is pretty quick, and most of us, I think, said we already have screens. So I want to just share with you a couple phases of technology that you might consider. Phase 1 is getting started. If you didn't raise your hand when I said how many of you have screens in worship, this would be where you're starting to get a screen in worship. I would actually recommend now that if you don't have a screen in worship, you buy a large flat screen rather than a projector and a screen. The thing about these projectors is that that thing has a bulb in it that's probably rated for like 2,500 hours or something like that. The bulbs cost $250, $300. Most of the churches that I visit, encounter, coach, are not willing to spend $250 on a new bulb, so they just let this thing go until it's so dim you can barely see it. But and then it's so old you can't get a bulb for it anymore. The thing about a large flat screen TV, even like a 90-inch, like that's huge, but not huge when it's hanging up there. There are two things that are better about it. One is that ambient light affects the projector. So, this image is a little bit dim, whereas if that was a big LED TV, it's made to be shown in a room with all the lights on. Also, an LED TV is made to be on every day, all the time. People watch television regularly, whereas a projector, the more you use it, the more the bulb wears out, and it's not long before you need to replace it. So if you haven't bought anything yet, I would recommend that. CVLI license, you do have to have a license to show movie clips in worship. We talked earlier about still images are fair game, but to show a movie clip, you have to have that CVLI license. It is based on your average attendance. If you show movie clips in worship and you do not have that license, you may inadvertently start a prison ministry that you are administrating from prison. No, seriously, I know of a church in Chicago that had to pay $40,000 in violations for showing movie clips. It's $10,000 per violation if you are caught. Now, it's very unlikely that you're going to be caught, but this was kind of a well-known church in downtown Chicago, and somebody caught them. Yes? CVLI is different than CCLI. CCLI is for song lyrics, so you are supposed to put that number when you display song lyrics. CVLI, I don't think you have to have it displayed. You might put it in your bulletin. You have to check the rules. I don't know for certain. But CVLI.com is where you can learn about that. Yes?
How do you find out if you have this license, and where do you get it if you don't?
CVLI.com is where you get it if you don't have it. I don't know where you would find out if you have it other than to maybe call them and see if you're on record or see if somebody at the church knows. Yes? Question is, does that include YouTube? YouTube is a crazy animal when it comes to that stuff. Technically, there are things on YouTube that are there illegally and they just have never been caught. So if you show something that is there illegally, they're not going to come after the person that posted it. Again, I think it's very unlikely that you're going to get, people are not out policing the church to find out if they're showing YouTube clips. But the letter of the law is that you have to have permission by the copyright owner. So I have actually contacted people on YouTube and say, hey, can I show this video in worship? And they'll say, I don't know where this came from. I saw it somewhere else and uploaded it to my account. For a while in my city, the NBC affiliate was having a dispute with Time Warner Cable, which I had at the time. And so we lost NBC for about 2 months. And I like watching Saturday Night Live. And I would go to YouTube on Monday morning, and if I got there early enough, I could watch the sketches on Saturday Night Live, but by about 8 or 9 o'clock, every single one of them would be taken down for a copyright violation. So you can upload something that's copyright, and if nobody ever catches you, it's there. So I would say you just have to kind of be careful. I would go the extra step of content. I'm not a lawyer, or I can tell you this, if you want to test it out and let me know what happens, I will make you an example at the next seminar. There's this tragic story about a guy I met in Pennsylvania who... Yes?
Just wanted to know, for those that might not know it, maybe you can add, there are services, whether it's Sermon Spice, Worship House Media, or Wing Clips.
Yep.
Actually do...
Yeah, I was going to mention that here. No, that's okay. You're leading right into. So if you don't have those licenses, there's 2 different places that you can go for Hollywood film clips. Wing Clips is one of them. And they've got like a free version. It's got a watermark in the corner, or you can pay like $15 and it removes the watermark. Or this other one called ScreenVue, ScreenVue. That's connected to CVLI. So if you have CVLI, I think you get a free membership to this. and you can download clips. And the only challenge with this is that, they pick the clips. You don't get to choose where it starts and stops and all that, but you don't have to have a CVLI to use this. Moving on, I'll mention Sermon Spice next here, and we're wrapping up. Second phase then is to use other people's media and a more beefy computer. So that number down there is 3,000 plus. A mid-level computer software. I've been using a program called ProPresenter all day. There are kind of 4 major programs. ProPresenter is one of them. It's cross-platform Mac and PC. MediaShout, which is also Mac and PC. It's probably the second most popular. ProPresenter seems to be the most popular. Third one is called Easy Worship. It's only on the PC. Its competitor, Difficult Worship, went out of business on the 4th day. And then there's another one, the name of it is Proclaim. I haven't used it, but I've been hearing people talk about it here recently. But if you Google that, Proclaim worship software. These are like PowerPoint on steroids, and it lets you do all sorts of additional things. It has Bible verses that you just say, I want John 1:1 to John 1:5, and it'll put all of it on there. You don't have to type anything in. It's got a song lyric license that you can dump all the song lyrics in. You don't have to type them. So those are definitely worth checking out. But here's where you can go to get some media stuff. Sermonspice.com is content for worship, so there are all sorts of clips. You pay about $15 to $30 per clip, and this is where you'd have illustrations and things like my stuff is on Sermon Spice as well. So a lot of the clips you've seen me play today are there. And then Worship House Media is basically the same idea. These are big clearing houses where you can buy media and stuff like that. Phase 3 then is where you begin to create your own stuff. There is a program called Adobe Photoshop, which is sort of the standard in the professional world to create images. And it's a great program. If you have no budget, though, there are a couple places you can go to get a free program called GIMP. G-I-M-P stands for Graphic Image Manipulation Program. And they've even got a version of it that's skinned that looks like Photoshop. It's called GIMP Shop, and I think it's .com. So if you have no budget, you can go with that. If you have a little bit of a budget, there's a program called Adobe Photoshop Elements. Adobe made this scaled down version of Photoshop. It's about $75 to $100 depending on where you buy it, when you buy it, if it's on sale. And most of us would never need to go beyond that. You'd hit the ceiling on that pretty quick. There's also something called the Creative Cloud now, and you pay a monthly fee, and you get access to all of Adobe's programs, animation, graphic design, all that. And I don't know what it costs for a church, but there's a website called TechSoup.com, and they have amazing prices.
It's about $250 a year.
$250 a year. So that's a steal. TechSoup. Like soup as in chicken noodle soup. TechSoup.
They have all kinds of software, not just.
Yeah, they have a bunch of different hardware and software, but they've got amazing deals for churches.
If you're the tech person doing your presentation and then downloading it on your church computer, your laptop, you have to have, again, these same.
Not for creation, but so if somebody created something in Photoshop, you can drop it in PowerPoint. As long as you have PowerPoint on the computer at the church, you're okay. You don't have to have Photoshop on both computers. Okay. The license, though, I don't know if you can activate it on 2 different computers or not. I'm not sure the answer.
Like Word will let you do both.
Okay.
And Photoshop will. Photoshop Elements and Photoshop Elements and Photoshop. You can get both for $99.
Okay, $99. All right, here's a couple places to go real quick to get stock photos. Shutterstock.com. You'll spend a few dollars per image. I say a few, 15 to 20 bucks an image. But if you're doing a series that was going to last for 5 weeks, and you want a really great picture, and you're not a photographer, you can remember that your cell phone is a great camera. You can take a picture yourself, or you can go and have somebody who knows what they're doing do it for a little bit of money. iStock Photo is another one that's kind of the same idea. Here's one that's a credit-based system, and you buy credits. It's called DreamsTime, D-R-E-A-M-S, dreamstime.com. And you'll pay, it says as low as 20 cents per image. I don't ever see any worth downloading for 20 cents, but they have them. I used to use this subscription service called photospin.com, and you pay a yearly fee, and it's somewhere in the like $200 to $300 range, but you can download hundreds of images a month, and it's all for that one price. And then this is no longer the URL. This has been bought out, and I think it's freestockphotos.com or something, but if you type in the letter SXC, this used to be the stock exchange, and I just need to update this graphic, and I haven't. SXC.hu used to be a Hungarian website. It got bought out by like freestockphotos.com. Anyway, if you type in SXC.hu, it'll forward to this, and there are free stock photos that people have uploaded, and then you can download them and use them however you'd like. And then one other resource here that you probably heard of and maybe didn't know there was a free option is the photo sharing site Flickr, F-L-I-C-K-R. They have on the little box up there with the magnifying glass, if you click on that, it'll take you to something that's called the advanced search. And at the bottom, there's this checkbox for what is called Creative Commons license. And that means that if I'm a photographer and I upload my stuff there and I say anybody can use this in the Creative Commons, it means I am granting permission for you to use my stuff. And they have a couple of stipulations. One says find content to use commercially, find content to modify, adapt, or build. And even though you're not a commercial organization, your use of those images would be considered commercial if you put it on your website or you put it in a bulletin or a brochure or whatever. So you do want to make sure you have that license. Now, the Copyright Act of '76 that I mentioned earlier says that you can use any still image in worship without violating copyright. Even if it's an image that you would have had to pay for somewhere, in worship, it's not a violation, but that does not mean you can broadcast it. That does not mean you can print it and put it on the bulletin that people can walk out with. But you could put any image on your screen and you're not violating copyright. There's, in the back of your handbook, there's 2 pages on that law and how that works. So you can check that out as you go home today. Phase 4 is where you start to add video production in, and this is a really steep learning curve, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it other than to say that you want to have either a 3-chip camera, which is a camera that's got all images are made up of 3 colors, RGB, red, green, blue. And a 3-chip camera has 1 chip for each color, and so that it processes things and the pictures look really nice. I don't recommend the 3-chip camera as much anymore because I'm a big fan of the DSLR cameras. That's a digital camera that shoots photos, and they shoot amazing video. I mean, both styles of camera, but you can get a DSLR camera, an entry level, for $700 or $600 or $700. The Canon Rebel is a really great camera to get started with. The only downside is that it doesn't record great audio. You have to have a way to record audio. You can email me if you want to talk more about that. Probably talk to Sean too. He knows a lot about this stuff. But I think this is a phase that some of us aren't going to probably get to for a while. A light kit, you do have to have extra light when you're shooting video. Cameras don't see light the same way our eyes do, so you have to have some additional lighting. If you don't have a light kit, shoot outside. The sun makes a pretty good light, but you have to also be careful that it can be overpowering sometimes. A nonlinear, that's an editor. So when you shoot something, you shoot it in a linear sequence. A nonlinear means you can take that and split it up into pieces and move things around. So when I shot Jonah, we shot it all out of order, and then you put it in a nonlinear editor where you can move things in the right order. If you have a PC, you have a program for free called Windows Movie Maker that's a real rudimentary editor. If you have an Apple computer, you have iMovie, which is also a free editor, and it'll do real simple editing. If you have that Adobe suite, you can use Adobe Premiere, which is part of that suite and is a great program. They also have a program called Premiere Elements, which is like Photoshop Elements. It's scaled down. You pay for it once. And then music. You can't just use your favorite tracks that you love off of, your Matt Redman CD or whatever. You have to have copyright clearance, a sync license, and that's really can get expensive. There's a company called Church Copyright Solvers. I think it's churchca.com, and they will help you get the licenses, but you have to pay for it. But if you want to do what you've heard me do today, you can buy stock music or royalty-free music. My favorite source for that is audiojungle.net. You pay $15 to $20 a track, and you download the track, and it's just most of them don't have vocals. There are some that do have vocals. Another one that I have used in the past is called Shockwave Sound. It's shockwave-sound.com. And then my current favorite one, actually, the one that I use more than any, I pay $20 a month and I get, I think, 5 credits or something, and they accumulate. It's called motionarray.com, M-O-T-I-O-N, motionarray.com. And most of what you've heard today has come from there. The last phase, the final piece before we say goodbye, is what I would call teaching ministry. And this is a phase that most of us will never reach, and that's totally okay, but this is where you begin to shoot multiple cameras in worship. You do what is called IMAG, or image magnification, and you project the person up onto the screen. In a sanctuary this size, it's really unnecessary. It wouldn't really make sense. I see churches sometimes that will do IMAG, and they have a camera in the back of the room like that, and they project the person on the screen, but if you were to put your finger next to the person and put your finger next to them on the screen, they're the exact same size. You're not actually magnifying them. You're just putting them head to toe on the screen at the same size as they are in your view. So it really is about getting closer. It creates more intimacy. Again, most of you are not going to need to do that. And then motion graphics. I've been using a program called After Effects to do a lot of the animation stuff. It's like Photoshop with a timeline. We can talk more offline about that if you want to learn more about it, but it's got a steep learning curve. So we have come to the end of our time together. We have a question? Yes.
Those numbers that we keep seeing on the bottom, what are those?
That's the approximate price for that phase. So yeah. So some of you, I'm going to pray us out here, and our host church today for great hospitality. Let's also thank the conference for the opportunity. They certainly paid for this to happen, made it happen, and so let's say thanks to the Susquehanna Conference for this. Some of you are coming back tomorrow, not to here. We're going to be at Lamar. What we're going to do tomorrow is actually engage in the process that I've been talking about today. We're going to design Advent using the lectionary text. We'll have 4 sessions. A lot of that really is going to be sitting around tables. I will come and kind of coach through that, and the teams at the tables will share in front of the whole group what they've come up with. We'll pick the best of those things and turn them into resources. Now, whether you come tomorrow or not, I believe you all have access to these resources. So if you want to make Advent this year your first creative worship experience, you'll have the opportunity to do that, and we'll have resources that are available for you.
Will we be using the Revised Standard Lectionary for this?
Yes. Yeah. The Common Lectionary. Yeah, we'll use the Revised Common Lectionary.
Will we bring our prepared book, or whichever one we may have, would that be helpful?
I believe so. I'm not like an expert on the lectionary, but I would imagine that would work. I still have to kind of look at the texts, but we'll kind of go over that in the morning. I'm going to do just a little bit in the morning to set the tone for the day and show some examples of what we're going to create, and then we'll spend the time creating it. If you're not coming tomorrow, that's cool. You know, you get to rest your ears tomorrow, and that's wonderful. But I'm looking forward to seeing some of you. Thank you so much for coming. You have been you're the best audience I have spoken to all day. So thank you so much. Thank you. last little piece, you have evaluations. If you could hand those in on your way out, or maybe just, there's a little table between the two doors back there with some, I don't know, maybe put it on that. Final thing is, if you have any questions that occur to you later and you'd like to email me, you can get me at mail, M-A-I-L, at midnightoilproductions.com. And if you have questions you didn't get answered today, or you need a little advice, or whatever, I will be happy to help you. And if, are we allowing walk-ins on one of the other days? Did I hear that?
We have prepared in case people who aren't registered arrive.
Okay, I thought Lori had said. So if you loved what you experienced today and you've got lay people that you think, gosh, it'd be great, we're doing this again on Saturday. It's going to be a little bit of a lay focus. Where are we at on Saturday? Faith Bellefonte. So if you know somebody that would like to be a part of this, again, it's lay focused, but it's really going to be the same material delivered slightly differently. Let me say a prayer and then you all can get out of here. God, we thank you so much for the opportunity to gather as brothers and sisters in you. God, I pray that as we leave this place, if our heads are spinning with all the possibilities, that you would help us to figure out the next step, what that next step is. Give us safety as we go from this place. Help us keep our eyes fixated on you as we move into the future. It is in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you for coming. It's been good hanging out with you today.